Welcome to In Conversation with writer and editor Sheila Bender, discussions on the writing life, a monthly chat with writers, publishers, and those who support the literary arts. Today, Sheila is interviewing Susan Bono.
Hello, this is Sheila Bender talking with you from our studio at KPTZ. Today I am interviewing Susan Bono from Petaluma, California. She's a freelance editor and writing instructor whose other passion is publishing personal narratives. To that end, in 1995, she established and edited Tiny Lights, a journal dedicated to the personal narrative. She also developed a companion website that features a monthly writers' exchange called Searchlights and Signal Flares, as well as instant essays, they're 500 words or less, for a quarterly posting called Flash in the Pan. She is on the advisory board of the Petaluma Readers Theater in the annual Mendocino Writers Conference. Her website is at tinylights.com/flash. Good morning, Susan.
Oh, good morning, Sheila.
I'd like to start today by reading something from your website that I think has a lot of meaning for those of us who write and for those of us who read what writers write. So let me quote you. You've written, "Writers have a lot in common with the prospectors who swarmed California in the 19th century, gold seekers set alight by visions of undiscovered riches. We literary treasure hunters work harder than any sane person should, chipping away at solid, unyielding rock or washing the gravel of parsimonious stream beds. It's a solitary, demanding life, and most of the time, all we end up with are a few pinches of bright dust that threaten to slip through our fingers. But gold is gold, no matter what size. These small strikes keep us fed and our dreams of the mother lode alive. Tiny Lights Publications honors the flash in the pan, those shining flecks of pure gold that often appear when we least expect them. When our hunger for bigger prizes is temporarily sated, when we relax and take the time to look at what's really in our hands. We are seeking pieces, you say, of your flash in the pan, of writing that may have appeared on a napkin, in a journal, or as a dream. 500 words or less, they are impossible to explain or categorize, and equally impossible to forget. These small gems will be posted quarterly on the Tiny Lights website, and you post your guidelines. I love that metaphor. I love that description of what we do sometimes as writers. Do you want to talk at all about your experience with the short form?
Well, you know, I'm hearing that description, and it's been a while since I've written that, but the excitement of those little glimmers of revelation. That all seems so exciting to me, and I think we can say a lot about how our attention spans are getting shorter now in this more hectic age. But I think that we all appreciate these little kind of slices, these thin slices of life. And as a publisher, I love being able to offer a venue for a lot of writers. These days with digital publication on the coming into the forefront. That's wonderful, and space isn't an issue so much. I started getting interested in these because as a hard copy publisher, I could feature more writers in a smaller space. So I don't know. I mean, I just think that it's kind of like being able to go to a smorgasbord and taste and sample and delight in lots of different voices.
So you're saying that if we write in the short form, publishers have more possibility of publishing more writers.
Well, I think that's one of the upsides of it, And we also have a chance of sort of joining in with a community right there in that venue, It's that then my little small piece might sit next to your little piece, and there are 5 or 6 or 10 of us or whatever, and that creates sort of like a chorus of voices too.
Ah, that's a nice thought. I have to say that as a poet, when I read Flash, I feel like the world's turning towards poetry without even knowing it.
Yes.
So many people think, I don't understand poetry. Poetry's hard. But Flash is very much like poetry, getting to the essence, relying very heavily on the density of images, trusting that a small moment has a large impact. And for me, that's one of the pleasures of Flash, is I feel like I am in the world of poetry. And it sounds like you're agreeing.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's kind of a sneak attack, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. And I was just talking with a group of writers last night, and we're talking about the idea of, I don't know anyone who's read every word of Moby Dick. But by the time you get down to a haiku where every syllable is absolutely essential, it's that idea when you condense and when you put language under pressure, you get the diamonds are created, and that's where, and I think that you're right. It's yes, flash essay is really but we don't need to call it poetry, Sheila, because that would
That's
scare
too scary,
people.
right?
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
So we're going to talk more about that, and especially also about the value of the longer narrative. But since you're talking about compression, and I know that you have years of experience as an editor, maybe some of what you've learned about compression comes from editing and helping other people arrive at the gems in their own writing. How do you think your work as an editor maybe influences your ideas about the quality of writing?
Oh, well, that's as far as compression, I think I learned my greatest lessons about compression with the little bit of newspaper writing that I did, because you're always confined to less space than you would like, and you start realizing that there's always more that you can cut. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's the point of diminishing returns where you feel like you've lost your story. But it's really interesting to really look at how can we be the most vivid and efficient in our writing. And so I think newspaper writing really helped me with that, and that sense of where the energy is in writing. And we all know that as readers, it's like we'll be going along and we'll be gripped and totally engaged, and then we kind of feel that kind of slackening of the thread, and learning to follow that sort of energetic feeling too has been useful. I don't know, it's a hard it's a hard question to answer. Really, is like, how do we learn to do these things?
It's a very hard question, and it's a hard lesson. I think that having readers for our earlier drafts is really important, because that energy note that you're talking about and where it goes slack is something that they're going to be able to tell us, where they're excited and engaged and interested, and where they feel like, well, they're distracted for a while until we get back to that energy. I always find first readers really, really valuable. They also sometimes identify places that we think, as writers, are beside the point or boring, and then suddenly they tell us, wow, that's where they really got engaged. And we learned that we wrote something on the page that we didn't understand the value of.
Yes. Sometimes it's funny. It's like sounds really mechanical, but as I read as an editor, I tend to actually look at the size of paragraphs. And we don't want to just it's not a mechanical thing, but what I've often noticed is that what you're saying about readers being able to identify hot spots or things like that, I often notice that writers can avoid or bury like a key idea, and it's often in the shortest little paragraph. It's sort of like they've been going along and they've been writing these fairly well-developed paragraphs, and they're all kind of an equal size. And then you see this little teeny tiny paragraph, and that's where the wound is hiding, or that's where the key idea is hiding. And we tend to hide. I think that we, as writers, we tend to do that because we're also humans, and we're trying to protect ourselves.
I think it's really interesting that you notice as an editor this pattern, that there'll be this undeveloped, say, if that's what you mean, paragraph. It's almost as if the writer inside the writer identifies that sort of adventurous area that could use more exploration, but almost turns their back on it immediately with the masonry of words. Yes.
Well, and again, because so often that's where the pain, there's pain lurking in there somewhere. It's forcing the writer within the writer to let go and to allow, so that we have to keep working to stop hiding from ourselves too in this.
Well, and Robert Frost is famous for saying, "No tears in the writer, no tears in the reader." So as a reader, if you're having tears, you know that the writer got there too, and that it's almost like a two-way mirror at that point, one soul seeing inside another's. And it takes a lot of courage to work your way through that as a writer, and it takes courage as a reader to stay with it. But I think those are the moments that we treasure in our writing when we can get there.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
As writers and as editors, I think we're always working with both the inside and the inside job of putting it out there, and then the outside job of knowing it's going to be received. And I think perhaps we're dangerous people, us writers and editors. When you say you notice pain and you, as an editor, are asking a person to go into that place, do you ever worry about that, the impact on that person?
Yes, I do. I think and that's one of the issues I think that we have as writers when we hear that it's important to show our work to other people. We have to be very careful, to whom we show this work, because I think we have to be really clear that that when I'm put my editor's hat on, it's that, yes, I'm going to put my finger, I'm going to try to pull. I feel like my job as an editor is to push my writers as hard as I can without breaking them.
A lot of sensitivity to be able to know.
And we can't always get it right. Wouldn't it be great if I had that confidence? But I know that it's not possible. That sometimes I'll be going along and I'll make the assumption that the writer is stronger than maybe he or she really is, and that's the risk. We always often hear about the risk that the writer must take in order to be edited, but I think the editor's also taking an equal risk, even though I would really rather that we all remain more loyal and sympathetic to the writer. I'm not saying that, poor editors, they have it rough too. It's not quite like that. But I think that it's important for writers to understand that there's an equal, that it's a collaboration, and there's a risk that the editor takes because I know that if I push a writer too hard, then they will stop. It will destroy whatever inspiration they had, or the seeds that they've planted, to finish the piece. And that's the last thing an editor wants to do, is to stop the process.
So how have you dealt with that? Can you recall a situation that was tenuous?
Well, what I've noticed for myself is that when I first started, so I have, with the exception of this year, so this is the first time in 18 years that I haven't run an annual personal essay contest. And so in my early years, when and I had less to do too, but I was very enthusiastic, and I've always seen my job as an editor, especially for Tiny Lights, as somewhat of a teacher, so that when I would get contributions to the contest, if I felt that in some way there was something that I could tell the writer about the piece, of how to improve it, I would do so, joyfully, in great detail.
Uh-huh.
And I found over the years that I occasionally got letters from people who were outraged that I would dare to do that. And I started, and it puzzled me at first. And then I started to realize, well, you have to be, was that person asking for feedback? I'm not sure, and it got me just sort of thinking about again how vulnerable we are and what my role is. And so I try to make it very clear. And so as an editor, I've learned to kind of scale back my impulse to give feedback to everyone who submits work to me. And I then try to kind of sense, and I can't tell you how this is. I mean, it must be just sort of some intuitive thing. And again, I'm not always right, but I now am getting more letters from people who are thanking me for the feedback, and it's like I think that I've learned to sort of like say a little less, and maybe not hold back, but to understand that we can only take so much. We can only take so much in a given session, and so I don't know. I mean, I think it's. Oh well, I don't know. I will also tell my writers, and maybe you do this too with your teaching. It's that I've become kind of the queen of the squiggly brackets. when instead of you'll see an editor will sometimes bracket a phrase or a sentence that he or she believes could be cut. And I tend to make little squiggly brackets and might put a question mark over the top, and then maybe make a margin note until my writer understands my style. It's like, maybe consider what would happen if you cut this.
This is KPTZ 91.9 FM, Port Townsend. In case you have just joined us, you are listening to Sheila Bender and Discussions on the Writing Life. Today, Sheila is interviewing Susan Bono.
How did you become an editor, Susan? I mean, I think editing and the way that you edit is a gift for writers, especially the ones who are ready to receive that gift. But it takes a kind of innate intuition. I don't think it's something that you can just be taught in school. And I'm wondering how you recognize that you had the gift.
Well, I was a high school English. I was a creative writing major back in the day when there weren't creative writing programs everywhere. But it was that sense of like, well, okay, I've studied short story and writing and poetry and novel. What am I going to do with that? And my parents were school teachers, and it seemed logical to get a teaching credential, which I did. So I taught high school for a number of years, and I enjoyed facilitating my students' writing a great deal. But then I decided to stay home with kids who are now in their mid-20s. So it's been a while since I've been in the public school classroom. But then I got involved in writing groups and things, and I just noticed that I really enjoyed facilitating other people's work. All of your listeners will understand that feeling of how you kind of get moved along on a certain path because you get feedback from people around you.
Right.
And so it's the kind of thing that people seemed happy with what I told them. And it made me happy, it made them happy, and I say this kind of facetiously, but it is really true that I do find it easier to tell other people what to do than to do it myself.
Well, that brings up a very interesting question, I think, for writers and editors. We as writers do help others in writing groups, where we have our own special companions who are our trusted readers, and we'll show our work first to them and get their opinions and advice. It is easier to see that energy thread that we talked about earlier in someone else's first draft than it often is to see it in our own.
Yes.
And it is some reflection we need back from the other person to mirror what we're trying to do in a way that leaves the distortion out, so we can see where our true voice is and where the other kind of I'm pumping these words onto the page voice is. I think it's probably very common for us to find it easier to facilitate another person's writing than to facilitate our own. And in my own experience, those people who work alone at their desk and don't show their work to anybody, and they'll write, and then they'll think they're all done and they're ready for someone to suggest an agent, are not really prepared for the editing process, for the fact that there's more work to do. But writers who are involved in exchanging with other writers and being in writers' groups understand that writing is a process, and it isn't just us alone with our work. As lonely and demanding as it is, and you say it in that description of being a writer, like a gold miner, that's part of it. But the other part of it, I think, really is understanding that trusted readers and listeners can direct our path in an important way. And if we don't agree with them, we can let the dust settle and see what element of what they were saying might have been true.
Well, I think it was Russell Hoban who said something about serving the work, and as opposed to, it's like your image of the writer sitting alone at her desk. And I actually have heard people say, well, when I cry, I know it's done, or something like that. And that's not always true, because if we're writing our story without really understanding its effect on an audience, like what you're saying, that collaboration with trusted readers and allowing yourself to be kind of pried open,
right,
a little more. I think that there's this idea that I think writing is such and when I say, well, it's easier for me to tell other people what to do, I also think to be honest, it's like the writers I know are among the most open and humble people that I have ever encountered. The really good ones are always saying, well, what can I learn about how can I serve my story?
I agree.
And,
can I add that thing about tears? It's really important. I think that when the writer's writing and has tears, like Robert Frost has said, no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader, they're in the vicinity, they're in the landscape of the pain or the joy. Sometimes great joy brings tears. The writing of it, though, brings us, my experience as writer brings me beyond tears. My work and myself and my two brains, right and left, seem so together that I am unaware of what I'm actually doing on the page until that session is over and I reread it. And sometimes what happens to me is, and then you revise and you begin to be past tears because it's this entity outside of yourself. And then I'll be reading something that I published years and years ago. And suddenly the tears well up in my throat, usually when I'm reading. And I think, wow, that piece of writing still contains that, even though in having to execute it, I had to become dry-eyed. Do you have an experience like that?
Well, yes, and I mean there is that kind of odd. Well, I mean I think we've all had the experience. Those of us who have done free writing in groups, where I will often, so free writing meaning someone gives a topic and we're all writing about it, and then a few minutes later we stop and then we share what we've written. That sense about being kind of I don't want to say disconnected, but just feeling kind of like just an observer writing along, and I'm writing along, and then it's my turn to read, and then I get. Then all this emotion that was just that I had managed to just kind of set aside while I was writing just slams me. So I mean there's that. I think we've all I've heard that happen in free writing groups where people have been sitting and writing and they don't seem to be visibly moved, and then it's their turn to read, and then they're shocked by the emotion that comes up as they're looking at words that they've written just moments before with kind of a calm and sort of feeling of omniscience, or you know what I'm saying, and control. And so, but I find it fascinating what you're saying too about having had to kind of go through that the initial storm of emotion, then get very kind of ruthless and dry-eyed about it. That's that's the crucible where art is created, I think.
I think so too. Now that we're getting towards the end of our conversation, I want to be sure that we talk also about the longer personal narrative. So we started out talking about flash, and then we've been talking about the many sides of a writer's life. You talked about writing in groups from prompts. We talked about editing, revising, having trusted listeners. What is it in the personal narrative of length, say, I'm guessing, but you can correct me, 3 to 10 pages, that allows a writer something different than in the flash form?
Oh, well, it's funny because when I started Tiny Lights, I had come across for sort of like arbitrarily a 2,000-word limit for the Tiny Lights length essay. And that's worked very well for me. But then with these annual contests, I would get these shorter pieces, which I would now call flash or instant essays. We don't have a good term for those yet. That it would be very hard for me to balance and judge these short pieces against these more developed pieces. And again, it's being able to take the time. And so that's why I actually created 2 categories, a flash category and what I call standard, but please understand that standard doesn't mean that essays have to be 2,000 words. That's just, it's an arbitrary distinction. But that idea of being able to take your time and explore ideas that just going deeper. It's the difference between, a novella and a novel that gets in, and you might get into generations, etc., which you wouldn't do in probably.
Right. So do you think it's fair to say that personal essay of around 2,000 words allows the writer to explore a life situation, to come to insight and discovery, and the flash allows a writer to evoke strongly a situation that is left there on the page for the writer and the reader to figure out how it fits into discovery, that it's more an evocation of something strong, and a personal essay lends itself to the ability to explore and reflect and gather insight?
Oh, you said that so well. I wish I'd said that. Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking it's very hard to make these separations because I'm thinking also of poetry, which I know moves towards insight as well.
Yeah.
But not in a leisurely way, in the way that a personal essay might.
Yes, and some people would say, if you read I confess that I'm not a regular New Yorker reader. 2,000 words isn't really that's almost like a flash essay for some publications.
Right.
That it's and I think I think as writers we get to find our forms, and I think we have lengths that live inside of us that we're more adept at, or that we just kind of naturally think of. I mean, I think there are people who think like novelists, people who think like poets or essayists, and so it's kind of the fun thing about it is to realize that there are all these different lengths that we can kind of play with, and which do we enjoy the most, and which give us the greatest sense of satisfaction when we engage with them.
Thank you. That is inspiring to hear you say that. And before we close our conversation, I would like to ask whether your website contains an archive of these flash pieces.
Yes. The flash in the pan at tiny-lights.com. There's that funny little hyphen between tiny and light that you have to put in there. But yes, there are 29 postings now. I've been doing it long enough that there are 29 opportunities for probably like 8 to 15 little essays a piece that are up on the website. And there are also contests. There are also the longer, the kinds of essays that have won prizes in the past. In past contests, they are also up on the contest archives. Not completely up to date. You might have to go back. Probably, I don't know. It's been a while since I've updated some of them. So you can have to fool around and search. But you can find some 2,000 word or less essays in those categories too.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for maintaining the page and for allowing people to see examples of what writers are doing today. And thank you so much for the discussion of editing. I think it was really helpful and will allow people to know a lot more about the writing process. And I really appreciate your words. Thank you so much.
Oh, it was a pleasure, Sheila.
Bye-bye, Susan.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to In Conversation with Sheila Bender, Discussions on the Writing Life. If you have a writing challenge, author, or question you'd like us to include in future conversations, email us at sbender@writingitreal.com. Producer, sound engineer, and editor Sheila Kalav. Executive producer Larry Stein. And announcer Kurt Vanderslice. You are listening to KPTZ 91.9 FM, Port Townsend.